unraveling labyrinth of consciousness, one encounters not merely the obfuscation of being, but the compounding reflexivity of its dissolution, wherein the is fractures into an infinite proliferation of anti-ontological echoes. To confront this phenomenon, we must suspend not only the predicates of knowledge, but the very predicate of predication, allowing cognition to implode upon itself and gestate its inverse, an epistemic nullity pregnant with its own negation. The phenomenology of this dissolution rests upon the paradoxical substrate of praxial entanglement, wherein every action reifies not its object, but its simultaneous refraction through the observer's interior ontic collapse. This collapse, far from being a mere entropy of cognition, births a radical mode of encounter, the autopoietic anamnesis. In this mode, perception ceases to be linear or even dialectical. It assumes a rhizomatic disfiguration that obliterates the boundaries of subject and object, intertwining them in a metastasis of relational infinitude. To name this state as being or non-being would betray the inadequacy of language, which itself fractures under the weight of the perceptive dissolution. What emerges is extra-linguistic torsion, a linguistic torsion that perpetually unnames itself in the very act of naming, transforming every signifier into a vessel for its antithetical resonance. The task, therefore, is to think through a mode of understanding that survives the collapse of understanding itself, a feat akin to tasting the bitterness of a color or hearing the weight of a thought. The recursive intuition of this process reveals its most troubling insight. Perception does not belong to the perceiver. It is an emergent property of the networked discontinuity between entities, an ontological lacuna that flows not as a river, but as a gaping absence consuming the shorelines of identity. To perceive them is not to apprehend an external reality, but to instantiate the chasm wherein reality cannibalizes itself. Here, one finds no solace, for the dissolution of perception is accompanied by the erasure of the perceiver. The result is neither annihilation nor transcendence, but a third modality entirely, interstitial beinglessness. Consider this interstitial state not as a void, for void implies presence through negation, but as a phenomenon we may term syntactic devourment. This is the process by which all systems of coherence consume themselves to reveal the incoherence that structured their coherence to begin with. One might argue this constitutes a form of nihilism, yet nihilism is too crude, too reliant on negation as a mode of affirmation. What we are left with instead is the affirmation of negationless dissolution, a framework that denies the binary of affirmation and denial altogether, and posits instead a spectral oscillation beyond human categorization. It is here that the observer's spirit, if it may still be called such, experiences its obliteration most acutely. For what can remain of identity, agency, or even desire in the face of a phenomenon that refutes every principle that renders these constructs intelligible? Yet paradoxically, in this obliteration, one finds not despair but a peculiar form of ecstatic resignation. It is as if the collapse of the self reveals a hidden plenitude, a perceptive fecundity that blooms not from the self's persistence, but from its radical dissolution. To speak further of this fecundity risks committing an epistemic violence against the very framework we have sought to articulate. Nonetheless, let us venture briefly into this forbidden territory. Within the fecund dissolution, one encounters what might best be described as a meta-ontological apotheosis. This is not an apotheosis in the traditional sense. There is no ascent, no glorification, no transcendence. Rather, it is the apotheosis of interbeinglessness, the recognition that all being is constituted by its interstitial disbeing, that existence and non-existence co-arise as the two asymptotes of an infinitely bending arc. The implications of this framework are as terrifying as they are exhilarating, for if perception itself is a recursive act of dissolution, then every act of knowing undoes the knower. And yet within this undoing, one finds a beauty so profound, it defies articulation, a beauty that exists not in spite of dissolution, but because of it. To behold this beauty is to experience a form of intellectual obliteration so total, so consuming, that it leaves no trace of the beholder's prior form. What remains is not even an afterimage, but a new modality of understanding, one so alien, so incomprehensible, that it can only be approached obliquely, through the shattered lens of its own impossibility. Thus we arrive at the ultimate paradox. To understand the recursive intuition of perceptive dissolution, one must relinquish not only the desire to understand, but the very framework that makes understanding possible. In doing so, one does not attain clarity but enters a state of perpetual becoming, an infinite series of unmaking and remaking that transcends all boundaries, all concepts, all realities. It is in this state, and only in this state, that one truly begins to think.